Welcome, everyone. I'm Bruce Baker, and this is another in the series on the history of New Orleans. And tonight I'm speaking with Dr. Kevin McQueeney of Nichols State University in Thibodaux, Louisiana. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about some of his research on race and healthcare in the early 20th century in New Orleans. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. I know that some of your work has to do with African Americans and their access to hospitals particularly, but could you just give us a bit of an overview of the focus of your research and some of the main themes?
Sure. So, yeah, a lot of my work is on Black healthcare history in New Orleans. I wrote my dissertation on apartheid healthcare in New Orleans, and originally that was my focus was going to be on the late 20th century in New Orleans and on the healthcare institution and on the healthcare industry and how it kind of rises up in post-war America as seen through the lens of New Orleans and the way that it impacts cities. And like a lot of historians, I did that thing where I started pushing back, where I was, well, if I need to understand the post-war period, I need to take a look at the early 20th century. And if I need to understand the early 20th century, I need to go back to Reconstruction. And if I want to understand Reconstruction, I better understand the Civil War and the antebellum period. And before you know it, my dissertation ended up talking about healthcare history in New Orleans from the founding through Katrina, which I think probably was very shocking to my dissertation committee. So I ended up writing, and this was what my dissertation ended up being on, and what I'm working on converting into a manuscript. It's about Black healthcare in New Orleans and the way that African Americans have been excluded from that system, the way they've been exploited in that system, and the way that African Americans have fought for access to that system. And I think that it's one of the continual themes that I found that I think still speaks to the contemporary situation for African Americans in healthcare in New Orleans and in a lot of cities, is that there is this long history that goes back hundreds of years where African Americans were largely excluded from a healthcare system that in a lot of ways also derived a lot of profit off of African Americans, and that Black New Orleanians fought for hundreds of years to achieve health equity and to achieve access. And for a long time period, that looked like the form of creating separate institutions, which is what ends up happening. And that was a lot of my research. So the article that I wrote for the Journal of African American History was about one particular Black hospital that African Americans created when they weren't able to have access to the main healthcare system, and they also didn't have access to healthcare education. They created separate Black institutions, a Black medical school out of the New Orleans University, and then created a Black hospital, Flint Goodrich Hospital, which got started in 1896. And I looked at how that institution and how it evolved as this kind of separate institution, and how it tackled the issue of public health care, because African Americans were disproportionately suffering from health disparity, and how that institution operated, and then also how simultaneously African Americans were fighting for access to that healthcare system that they were being excluded from. And they are able to successfully push for this in the 1960s. And then what was the impact on both Black healthcare in the forms of institutions like Flint, which ultimately ends up closing in 1985. And it's such an important institution, and it gets closed. And then how even in this time period where African Americans gain access to healthcare in institutions primarily like Charity Hospital, how Black health declines in this period. Flint Goodrich closes, and how the healthcare gap, the health equity gap, which it almost gets closed by the 1960s due to the work of Black doctors and nurses and public health activists, how it actually worsens by the time period where the Black mortality rate, which is double that of whites at the early 20th century, gets closed by the end of the 60s to almost equal. The Black mortality rate is about 10% higher than whites in New Orleans by 1969. And then by Katrina, it's back up to double, which is, I always just kind of found as a shocking statistic, and trying to understand why that was too, and how that legacy continues to this day, how you still have this kind of historical legacy of health inequity and then lack of access to healthcare.
That's really interesting. One of the things that, as you were saying about the closing of that Black hospital, it reminded me a bit of the argument that David Soselsky made about the closing of Black schools, that these were separate and they were unequally resourced and funded, but they were institutions that the Black community controlled, and that they're, in schools, they valued the students and there were really good relationships and stuff. And then they got sort of dumped into a white system and, lost, they gained a lot, but they also lost quite a bit.
Oh,
Does that
absolutely.
seem similar with the healthcare institutions?
I think it does, and I think you can see that a similar trajectory of what happens to the education system in New Orleans, right? I mean, New Orleans, it is a segregated school system until 1960, and then New Orleans goes through this school crisis post Brown versus Board, where they adamantly oppose this, and the same thing is going on in healthcare. African Americans in New Orleans, basically from the late 19th century through the 1960s, they are exclusively shut out of the healthcare system, where their options are they can use Charity Hospital, which is the original hospital in New Orleans that dates back to the founding of the city. It's in the United States. It was opened, it was the second longest continually operating hospital in the United States. It opens just a couple months after Bellevue in New York, and it's an institution that is designed to provide care for individuals with lower economic resources. In the late 19th century, the only people that could use that space, only access to healthcare for African Americans, was Charity Hospital, and only low-income residents could use it. There was an income threshold, so they could use that space, but they could only use a separate space, right? Similar to the school system. It is a physical separation in the forms of New Orleans. Some cities will create separate Black public hospitals. New Orleans decides to start a separate wing, and Charity was segregated before. Charity is a hospital that in the antebellum period does not treat free people of color, but does treat enslaved people when enslavers would bring them in. There was a number of hospitals that operated in New Orleans that would provide healthcare to enslaved people, but only when enslavers would bring them in. And this was kind of a way that healthcare operated and expanded in New Orleans, because enslavers would provide resources for them. Hospitals like Toro, which gets started in the mid-19th century by the Civil War, half of their income is based upon enslavers bringing in enslaved people. Post-Civil War, during occupation, the federal government occupies the city and Charity Hospital is desegregated, but the private institutions are not. And then once Reconstruction ends and the color line gets drawn up again and the Redeemers get, rise to power again, they shut out those spaces. They kick African Americans out of the school system. They segregate New Orleans school system, which has been desegregated for several years under occupation. And very similarly, they segregate the hospital system. Charity Hospital resegregates again immediately after Reconstruction ends. And they create separate Black spaces and then separate Black wings. So African Americans are being treated in a separate wing, separate ward in Charity, and it's underfunded and it's understaffed and it's overcrowded, which I think is very similar experience to Black schools. And the Black schools in New Orleans are underfunded. They're in decrepit buildings, usually formerly white schools that they said this building is no longer safe, and so they would convert that into a Black school. The teachers there were underpaid, and it's a similar experience for the healthcare, where they could use Charity and be subject to this underfunded system. I mean, there would be reports, people, the American Medical Association visited charity in the 1920s, and they found that sometimes a lot of patients were forced to sleep 3 people to a bed in a hospital. I mean, which is, appalling. People would be forced to sleep on wooden pallets in the hallways because there was just not enough space there, and the city just wasn't providing any funding for this. The state wasn't providing any funding for this. So that was one option. They could get treated into the system if they were under a certain income level, and they could go to this system. And then for people who are above that income level, there's nothing. So African Americans create Flint Goodrich in the 1890s. It's started by an African American women's organization, the Phyllis Wheatley Club, and they start this. They started at New Orleans University, which is a Black university. They have created a Black medical school, which they've been trying to do since the 1870s, 1880s, and they have several failed attempts because the state legislature fails to provide funding for them, even though they are required to under the state constitution. I think kind of similar to the education experience. And they finally get a medical school off the ground because medical schools do not accept Black doctors. So they create this separate Black medical school, and they start this hospital, and the university ends up taking it over in 1896. And they start this hospital, and that is then the other option for African Americans. That there's a small private hospital. It's pretty small. It starts off with 6 beds. They expand in the 1930s, and I think at their peak there's something like 148 beds, but it's pretty small for the Black population in New Orleans. And I think that's somewhat similar to the education experiences. You have the option of going to these underfunded, under-supported schools, separate school systems, or sometimes private school systems, which are being paid for by African Americans themselves. And when the hospital system integrates, Flint really is negatively impacted because they lose a lot of their funding sources. So much of their funding sources was based upon donations, and a lot of it came from white residents, actually, because they would make appeal to white residents, and they would say, you have basically 2 options. You can either integrate healthcare, because the reality is, you don't care about Black health, but if African Americans get sick, there's no color line for disease. I found some really great primary sources from fundraising where, the phrase that they use is that the microbe knows no color line. That, if there's a contagious disease, tuberculosis outbreaks, cholera outbreaks, smallpox outbreaks, it's going to spread because African Americans are working in Black homes as domestic workers. They are working in the community on the docks in these manual jobs, and then they're going to spread it. And there's no way you can stop that. So you need to do something. And it's either you let African Americans into the healthcare system, or you give money to support this separate Black institution. And so that's a big funding source for them. And once integration happens, the funding source dries up. African Americans use charity, and charity, which is separate Black ward and then the main white ward. It's most of the patients, over 60% of the patients, are white. As soon as charity gets integrated in the 60s, the same thing that happens to the schools happens to charity. It's white flight from the healthcare system, like it is from education. Whites leave charity, and by the end of the 20th century, it's predominantly used. Over 75% of their patients are African American, and the same thing that happens to the school system also happens to hospitals too, where the main public hospital becomes African American use, and as that happens, every year the state cuts funding for it. So as more Black patients are using it, the state decides to cut funding for it. So the quality of care decreases, the number of doctors decreases, the number of bed decreases as African American usage increases. And I think that's very similar to the experience for a lot of the education system for the New Orleans school system, right? The funding dries up due to white flight and state budget cuts. The school gets predominantly African American, and the quality of care at both these institutions dries up. And then, Flint, which is this this really important institution, not just for healthcare, but it's also the largest employer, Black-owned employer in the state of Louisiana. They are the only institution in the Deep South in the early 20th century that has Black doctors. There's no other hospital in the Deep South that will hire a Black doctor, and they're the only one. And they hire Black doctors and nurses and have incredible training programs. And they're a real institution for the Black community. Their sources kind of dry up. White banks refuse to give them loans, and the quality of care decreases, and they're forced to close their doors. And it's a sad story that I think mirrors and echoes a lot of what's going on with education and a lot of other Black institutions. That, civil rights is supposed to be a positive story about integration, and that's supposed to be kind of the narrative. And the reality is that, unfortunately, there are the negative side effects of white resistance to civil rights. And one way they do this is they cut funding for institutions that become Black used, like public schools and public hospitals. And so Flint closes its doors in 1986, and then Charity Hospital. It provides healthcare for 75% of the Black residents in the city. And there are over something like 25 hospitals in the New Orleans area which are providing care for white patients. So it's public versus private. It is this underfunded, overcrowded public hospital. And then there are these well-funded private spaces that are providing healthcare for whites. A lot of them are white flight hospitals that pop up in the surrounding suburbs, Metairie and Slidell and Kenner and these communities. So people leave the city core, they go to these suburban centers that rise up in the 50s, 60s, 70s as New Orleans integrates. And they go to private schools, and they use private hospitals, and they create these private country clubs and all these other institutions to kind of maintain Jim Crow in a lot of ways. And healthcare is going to suffer. And it's a sad story, because then a lot of the same issues that you saw under Jim Crow are perpetuated in the late 20th into the 21st century.
Yeah. Wow, that's a really fascinating story, and especially the way it kind of tracks other sort of stories of institutional change across the Jim Crow and civil rights period. I was intrigued by what you said about this being the only hospital in the Deep South that had Black doctors, and the role that it played in training Black doctors and nurses. And I wonder, was it, I suppose if you were African American and wanted to be a doctor almost anywhere in that part of the South, you might gravitate there. And then likewise, was there sort of a diaspora of people who had trained there who sort of established links and networks? So I guess I'm thinking, is there sort of an equivalent to kind of like the Tuskegee network of community leaders across the South connected to this hospital?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I think you do see kind of a creation of these networks. Basically for Black doctors in the late 19th and into the 20th century, there are very few options. Very few medical schools in the United States are open to African Americans. There's only a couple in the late 19th century white institutions which will allow Black doctors. So there's the creation of Black medical schools. Howard, is going to be the first one and the most prominent one. And then a couple other medical schools get created. There are a couple medical schools which get started in New Orleans. Straight University and New Orleans University make several attempts. They have one-year programs that get shut down because the state refuses to fund them. And it's something like the 6th and 8th Black medical schools, and they get shut down. And the New Orleans University finally gets their program off the ground in the late 1880s. And they're one of only a handful. There is more Black medical schools that open up, and they are primarily being funded by the Black community and then also by churches and different nonprofits. And that institution, the New Orleans University Medical School, which becomes Flint Medical School, it is, the main medical institution, not just for people from New Orleans, but from people throughout the Deep South. They come there, they get training there, and it's a remarkable institution. And unfortunately, they get closed down in the early 20th century. the American Medical Association sponsors a study by Abraham Flexner, and he writes a document known as the Flexner Report, and he visits all the medical schools in the United States. And American Medical Association has decided they want to bring some type of uniformity to medical school training, which can be good because there's a lot of medical schools which are providing bad levels of medical education, which is pretty scary because, you know, then you're having these untrained doctors. But the Flexner Report basically visits all these medical schools, and for all the Black medical schools, it writes negative reviews, and these negative reviews don't have any binding power, but the negative reviews go to the institutions which are funding these medical schools, and he recommends closing them. So basically, by the 1920s, every medical school, Black medical school, except for two, one out of Nashville and one in the Howard, get closed. And so there's two medical schools in the United States for African Americans that are run by African Americans, and then there's a handful of other white medical schools that will treat them. But the vast majority of Black doctors in the United States are being trained by two schools up until the mid 20th century, Howard and Meharry out of Nashville. And Flint Medical School is a victim of this. They get shut down. They lose a lot of their funding sources. The city decides that they would like to shut them down. They cite them for having structural problems, so they close the school. They try to reopen, they reopen, and then they get closed again. And there's all these plans for reopening them, and it never happens. So there's, after 1915, there's not a Black medical school that people can use from New Orleans. And so what ends up happening is people who want to become a doctor from New Orleans go to Meharry. They get trained at Meharry, and then they'll come back to Flint. And Flint is fascinating because, like I said, they're the only school, the only hospital in the Deep South for decades that will allow Black doctors to operate. There are a number of hospitals that are open up in the South that are for Black patients, but they won't hire Black doctors because they're primarily run by white institutions, white churches, white philanthropic groups, and they won't hire Black doctors. And so Flint is the only one that does this. And so they'll hire doctors. They also have a postgraduate program because a lot of hospitals in the United States won't provide any postgraduate training, won't provide any type of internship. So you do have a lot of doctors who, they go to a Black medical school like Howard or Meharry, they come to Flint, they do their internship or they do a postgraduate training there, and then they go all over the United States, you know, to medical hospitals in some of the big ones in Chicago and LA and Baltimore. And so they do kind of create this network all over the United States where, you know, you'll do your training there and then go there. They operate, and then, you know, when they close their doors, it's also this loss of this great institution which is providing opportunities for doctors. Flint also suffers. One of the reasons that Flint also suffers too is because a lot of Black doctors leave New Orleans in the post-World War II period. It's like the Great Migration story. There's a lot of Black doctors who are staying in New Orleans, and, you know, New Orleans is going through Jim Crow, and a lot of them are subject to discrimination. The local medicals chapter, the American Medical Association, their chapter in New Orleans, they don't desegregate until the mid 1960s. Louisiana is the last state to have their medical societies desegregate. So Black doctors can move to New Orleans, but the medical chapter won't let them in. It won't give them postgraduate training. It won't allow them access to medical libraries. They can't do research. And in the post-World War II period, a lot of them go to California. They go to the North because they say, why am I going to stay in New Orleans when I have these opportunities to move somewhere else where I can get paid better? I am not subject to as much discrimination. And so the number of Black doctors decreases after World War II, which is, you know, a kind of brain drain that's happening. And it's, you know, it's a story that's also going on in the late 19th century too, right? The first the first Black female doctor in Louisiana is a graduate of New Orleans University in the 1890s. And she practices in New Orleans and then moves to California because, you know, she's not going to stay in Louisiana and be subject to Jim Crow. And it's a sad story about opportunities that exist elsewhere that I think is echoes a lot of the experience for a lot of New Orleanians, where a lot of them just, if they have means to go somewhere else, they do so because New Orleans is pretty bad in this time period. So a lot of Black doctors will leave. And then when the hospitals integrate, Flint is primarily reliant upon its Black medical doctors as its core, and then has a lot of doctors with visiting privileges, a lot of white doctors, that they will treat their patients, their Black patients at Flint. When desegregation happens, Flint wants to desegregate, and they want to treat white patients. They think that this is, going to open things up. We will treat white patients, and white patients refuse to come to this Black hospital. They make a rule that they say to the white doctors, you can't just treat your Black patients here and then your white patients somewhere else. If you want to keep privileges here, you can't practice this. And so en masse, almost every single white doctor resigns, and they just leave. And then Flint is left down to this core of less than 30 Black doctors, and this predominantly low income patients, because the white doctors take their higher paying Black patients, they move them to other hospitals. And then Flint and Charity, one of their major problems is they are heavily reliant upon Medicare and Medicaid, which Flint actually looks at as they think it's going to be a kind of a great funding source, because there's this promise in the 60s of the federal government giving money to hospitals to provide care for low-income patients. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is the government underfunds Medicare and Medicaid. And so Flint is constantly battling every single year, requesting more money for Medicare and Medicaid compensation, because they're breaking even or sometimes losing money off of providing a medical procedure. So they'll perform this medical procedure for this low-income resident on Medicare and Medicaid, and the government, which is compensating them through Medicare or Medicaid, it takes months and months to get the compensation, and sometimes they'll get denied. And even if they get paid, the money is just not enough. And so they're in this battle with the government that, because we've created this system where it's not some type of socialized medicine, it's this weird kind of private, public hybrid. It's this kind of back and forth. And it underfunds and drains the hospital. And the same thing for Charity. I mean, Charity is the Medicare and Medicaid hospital, and private hospitals in the city illegally deny Medicare and Medicaid patients. So this is also part of the story too, is that integration happens and private hospitals decide, they're just not going to honor integration. They're not going to hire Black doctors. They're not going to take Medicare and Medicaid patients, and they just legally deny it.
Does that mean that these private hospitals, by refusing to take patients who are funded by Medicare and Medicaid, they're taking private paying or private insured patients who are able to, and I suppose those insurance companies do pay more promptly and pay higher rates or whatever? Is that
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is very much a story about American healthcare in the 20th century, is that, World War II, post-World War II, healthcare gets attached to your employer, not based upon who you are, but based upon your employment. Medicare and Medicaid comes in, and it's supposed to provide healthcare because there's so many people in the United States that don't have it. And private hospitals, they just don't want to deal with this. So they refuse to accept it, which is illegal. Part of the passage of Medicare and Medicaid is that if you don't treat Medicare and Medicaid patients, you can lose federal funding and you could be closed down. And the hospitals just say, we're just not going to do it. We don't care. We're going to take private insurance because that is going to compensate us, and compensation continually goes up, and it's a good funding source for them. And Medicare and Medicaid is not. And the NAACP and Black patients, they sue hospitals in New Orleans. There are repeated lawsuits. They push the federal government. There is an investigation by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare into hospitals in New Orleans in the 1970s. It's like a 6-year investigation. And they find that almost every single private hospital in New Orleans, which prior to the civil rights era was all white and refused to accept Black patients, refused to hire Black doctors, they're continuing to do that. They're continuing to turn away Black patients. They're continuing to turn away Medicare and Medicaid patients. They're continuing not to hire Black doctors. And the federal government sues them, and they say, listen, if you're not going to do this, we're going to strip you of federal funding. This is illegal. And most of the hospitals say, okay, go ahead. And the federal government starts a process. They say they're going to strip them. and then it goes before a judge, and the judge ultimately decides, you know what, we're not really going to punish them, and so nothing happens. And so these private hospitals continue, they perpetuate, this apartheid healthcare system, where it's private hospitals for white patients, private hospitals for patients who have good insurance from their employer, and then it's the one public hospital for Medicaid or Medicaid and predominantly African American patients, because the government is not willing to follow through with, pursuing civil rights implementation.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's a lot of doctors that just, they want to maintain apartheid healthcare. And it's kind of a sad story too, in that sense that it's a lot of private decisions that are mixing with the failure of the government to enforce this, and they perpetuate this system that is supposed to end, and just does not happen.
It's interesting to me the way the sort of private decisions and public decisions sort of blend together to create this apartheid system. And I just wanted to say maybe a good way to wrap things up would be just to focus on your use of the term apartheid, which has popped up a few times. And I know that you've done some other work sort of comparing New Orleans to South Africa. And I wonder if you could just reflect a bit on the sort of transnational similarities you see, and why that seems to be a relevant term.
Sure. I purposely chose the term apartheid because the apartheid, it's a term that is most associated with the system from South Africa, where they create this system that is designed to create physical separation between white and Black people in South Africa. And it's also a purposeful decision that is mixing in segregation, but also it's a purposeful decision that part of their outcome is basically to kind of perpetuate almost genocidal policies. I mean, this is purposeful decisions that the outcome is going to be negative impacts upon Black residents, and they are okay with this. They want to kind of perpetuate this system, and so I decided to use that term apartheid because of this, because I think apartheid it captures this decision that it's a purposeful decision. It is a purposeful decision of the government. The government in the United States supports physical segregation during Jim Crow period. It supports slavery in the antebellum period, and it is not something that is inadvertent, right? I liked the term apartheid too, because apartheid is a purposeful decision by the South African government to create the segregation, to create this separation, to target the Black population. And I wanted to make sure that the terminology that I was using show that it is purposeful decisions by government officials, that it is purposeful decisions by leaders in the healthcare field, that is targeting African Americans, that is excluding them, that is exploiting them, that sometimes I think that if I didn't use that term, I didn't want to make it seem like that this was just something that was inadvertent, that was kind of accidental, kind of a weird thing that's happening in history. I think in South Africa, you see that the system of white supremacy in South Africa and the United States, it causes damage to the Black community, and it's a purposeful damage, and it reinforces itself. And one of the interesting parallels is that South Africa is one of the first places to create physical separation between Blacks and whites. And it's a model that gets copied in other systems, right? We see this in India as well. And then the United States will copy this and implement this when they create systems like racial residential segregation ordinances. Baltimore is the first one in 1910, and leaders of Baltimore travel to places all over the world and they copy India and South Africa, and then they institute this system here. New Orleans institutes its own racial residential segregation ordinance in the 1920s, even though they've been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1917. And one of the justifications that white leaders use for creating physical separation, where they say only whites can live in this neighborhood, is that African Americans have higher rates of disease and high rates of mortality, and so they could spread disease into white neighborhoods. Even though the reason that African Americans have higher rates of disease and mortality is because they created Jim Crow to begin with. So they create this kind of self-perpetuating loop, right? And that's what happens in apartheid. You know, you create this self-perpetuating loop where you say that African American, or that South Africans, Black South Africans should be separated. They are inferior. Here's white supremacy, and you create this system of poor education and poor health that impacts the Black community. And then you say, look at this impact on this. You know, look at the Black community and their lower levels of education, their lower levels of health, and that's why we have to have segregation. And it's just this self-perpetuating loop, but it's a system that's purposeful. And the United States, that happens. The federal government is complicit and sponsors slavery. It is complicit and sponsors segregation under Jim Crow. It is complicit and it sponsors some of the gentrification that is happening in the 20th century that ties in with healthcare as well. This is something, you know, that I found too, is that when hospitals are built, they're oftentimes built and they displace Black residents. This is a story of, you know, kind of contemporary healthcare. And this goes back to the early 20th century when Charity Hospital decides to expand and build a new hospital. They get a federal grant from the WPA, and they get a slum clearance, a so-called slum clearance grant to expand Charity Hospital. And Charity Hospital is located in an area which is predominantly Black. It's a low-income area. And they designate this as a slum, and they kick out Black residents to build this new hospital paid for by the federal government with, you know, slum clearance money paid for by the federal government, with Black workers working for the WPA doing a lot of the building and the clearance themselves to build this institution, which is a Jim Crow segregated institution. I wanted to use something that I think connotated how this is policy decisions, and it is purposeful decisions by white government leaders, civic leaders, healthcare leaders that created a system of inequality, of health inequity, and that, you know, kind of creating that health inequity was also one of the goals. And then that they use that as justification for larger systems of segregation.
That's really interesting, and it really helps bring the significance of healthcare into the history of Jim Crow. Thanks very much for this really interesting conversation that really sort of opens out a whole side of the history of New Orleans that we hadn't really looked at until then. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.